In the news, you might have seen the so-called Freedom Convoy, a Canadian trucker convoy that's currently occupying Ottawa. The Freedom Convoy was originally about opposing the federal government's vaccine mandates for truckers coming across the US border, but has now morphed into a wider protest against vaccine mandates generally, Trudeau's Liberal government, and inflation. So let's have a look at what's happening in Canada right now. This topic was suggested by a load of you, so we thought we ought to make a video on it. If you want to submit your topics for our consideration, then follow the link that's in all of our video descriptions. So, the story probably starts on January the 15th, when the Canadian government imposed a federal vaccine mandate requiring all unvaccinated truckers returning to Canada across the US border to quarantine for 2 weeks and submit negative COVID tests before returning to Canada. Previously, truckers and other essential workers had been exempt from Canada's 2-week quarantine law, which applies to anyone crossing the Canadian-US land border. In response, on Sunday the 23rd of January, a relatively small group of truckers in British Columbia who opposed the mandate started a convoy with the intention of travelling the breadth of Canada all the way to Ottawa. Now, there is a good faith argument to be had about the aptness of this policy. After all, any improvements in vaccination rates or net COVID infections has to be weighed against the policy's interaction with personal liberty and its impact on inflation. Canada imports some $21 billion worth of food from the US each year, and supply chains are already strained thanks to the pandemic and labour shortages. Nonetheless, it's worth saying that this policy was popular with both truckers and the wider Canadian public. The Canadian Trucking Alliance estimates that 85 to 90% of the 120,000 Canadian truckers who work cross-border routes are vaccinated, and while it's possible that some vaccinated truckers nonetheless oppose the mandate, it's unlikely that more than 30% of truckers had an issue with it. The Canadian public also endorsed the policy. Polling has found that about 2/3 of Canadians are keen for vaccine mandates, and vaccine mandates for truckers. This is presumably because Canadians are pretty pro-vaccine generally. 83% of the population above 5 is fully vaccinated, and Canada has the 7th highest vaccination rate in the world. Nonetheless, the convoy raised enough money via their GoFundMe page to get started, and received substantial media attention from what we might call the non-mainstream media, including Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand.
I got trucking on my mind. There's a great big convoy trucking across Canada. So why is no one in the mainstream media talking about it?
It even attracted the support of former President Donald Trump, who called the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau a far-left lunatic who has destroyed Canada with insane COVID mandates. By the time the convoy reached Ottawa on January the 29th, police estimated that there were somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 vehicles, although it's worth saying that only a minority of them were truckers. Convoy organisers insisted that the numbers were higher, claiming that there were between 36,000 and 50,000 heavy trucks. While this number seems implausibly high, it's nonetheless true to say that the protest, now dubbed the Freedom Convoy, had expanded beyond a few truckers complaining about a vaccine mandate. There were at least enough vehicles to bring the centre of Ottawa to a standstill, and Trudeau had to be moved to an undisclosed location to ensure his safety. The organisers even raised over 10 million Canadian dollars, or about £5.8 million, on their GoFundMe page. As tends to happen with these sorts of things, an argument then ensued over how to characterise the protests. After reports of Nazi imagery at the protests, Trudeau said, "Freedom of expression, assembly and association are cornerstones of democracy, but Nazi symbolism, racist imagery and desecration of war memorials are not," and described the protest as a small fringe minority who hold unacceptable views and fail to follow the science. On this point, it's worth saying that the truckers are only supported by a minority of Canadians. A recent poll by Abacus Data suggested that 68% of Canadians felt they had very little in common with the protests, while 32% said they had a lot in common with the truckers. Other state officials described the convoy's descent on Ottawa as a nationwide insurrection and a siege. The organisers, for their part, insisted that the protests were peaceful and solely to do with the vaccine mandate. Now, both perspectives here probably have an element of truth. The convoy has brought Ottawa to a standstill, and it's fair to say that the protests have expanded into wider anti-vaccine and anti-Trudeau protests. It's hard to tell, but it looks like some of the protesters oppose vaccine mandate. Some oppose the impact of the trucker vaccine mandate on inflation, which, by the way, is already running at a 30-year high of 4.8%, and some oppose vaccine and COVID restrictions generally, and some just dislike Trudeau. But this is inevitable with a big protest. Other, more extreme groups will always jump on the bandwagon, and to be fair to the organisers, there's little they can do to stop it. And while there have been a few arrests and limited damage to state property, the protests look largely peaceful. We should say we're not trying to minimise criminal behaviour or taking the side of the truckers. It is just true to say that there's been less disruption than you would usually expect from a protest this size. Nonetheless, you can see why the Canadian government would be a bit stressed out about it. After all, the convoy has caused significant disruption in Ottawa, and protests of this size are always volatile. While Trudeau has ruled out sending in the military, on Sunday evening, riot police started dismantling the truckers' camp, and there were reports of police seizing gasoline from the truckers. On Monday, after 10 days of protests, Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson declared a state of emergency in the Canadian capital, granting the government more powers to disperse truckers. GoFundMe then announced that it would be removing the convoy's donation page and returning all donations, claiming that the organisers had violated their terms of service. Interestingly, Canada's Conservative Party, the main opposition to Trudeau's Liberals, have taken a more sympathetic tone. Conservative MPs who don't like Trudeau's vaccine mandates have expressed their support for the truckers, and on February the 2nd, Conservative leader Erin O'Toole was ousted by his party, in part because he'd been reluctant to wholly endorse the truckers. O'Toole originally decided to meet with the protesters, but then, after reports of Nazi symbolism, denounced a, quote, handful of unacceptable incidents. Candice Bergen, his deputy, was voted in as interim leader. This is interesting for Canadian politics because A, it means that the Conservatives will be on their fifth leader since Trudeau was elected leader of the Liberals in 2013, and B, it seems to suggest that O'Toole's attempts to modernise his party has been rejected by his MPs. Anyway, that's the so-called Freedom Convoy. But what do you think? Are these truckers anti-vax loons, or has Canada's government overstepped with their vaccine mandates? Let us know what you think down below. And as always, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos just like these people, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is down below.